Good morning, everyone. It's good to see everyone here today in this way. And we're now in lockdown for another 2 weeks. And we don't know how many more weeks after that. So there is a lot to lament for. So we felt like this is a good time to be learning how to lament and just meditating on a book in the Bible that's just so deep, so profound, so heartbreaking, and still so hopeful. So we're in chapter 2 right now, and it's in a series called Suffering Without Silence, because in our culture, we kind of tend to suffer in silence because we're ashamed or we don't want to see, we don't want to be seen in our suffering. We usually want to be seen in our glory. And sometimes grieving over what's gone wrong is seen as a sign of lack of faith. But I want to show you how lamenting can actually be a sign of a very tender and a very broken and a very genuine faith. So remember when I was young, it's so young that my parents used to monitor what music I listened to. Every now and then they'd catch me watching MTV, and there's this one particular song that came on. I remember both my mom and my uncle looked at each other and they said, "No, no, he can't listen to this song." And it was REM's "Losing My Religion." And it was because if you've seen the video, it's a very melancholic, kind of moody video in which, and it seems to suggest somebody losing their faith. But losing my religion is actually a very Southern American way of saying I've come to the end of my rope. So it's not actually saying I've lost my faith. It's actually a way of saying I've come to the end of my rope, and he's kind of picking on that. And the question I want to get at today is, what do you do when you get to the end of your rope? You know, what do you hold on to when there's nothing left to hold on to? And how do you experience the reality of suffering and the reality of God at the same time? How does that happen? And if we're going to look at three things in the keeping in mind the whole chapter, but just meditating on the first 5 verses as a sample of the rest of the chapter. But we're going to see three things. We're going to see that suffering is real. We're going to see that God is real, and we're going to see that rescue is real. So we're going to see that suffering is real, God is real, and rescue is real. And I want to just look at the first few verses. Okay, so let me read them out to you again. So, how the Lord in His anger has set the daughter of Zion under a cloud. He has cast down from heaven to earth the splendor of Israel. He has not remembered His footstool in the day of His anger. The Lord has swallowed up without mercy all the habitations of Jacob. In His wrath, He has broken down the strongholds of the daughter of Judah. He has brought down to the ground in dishonor the kingdom and its rulers. He has cut down in fierce anger all the might of Israel. He has withdrawn from them His right hand in the face of the enemy. He has burned like a flaming fire in Jacob, consuming all around. And he goes on. Now, I want you to notice in a few things. I kind of went through the whole chapter and translated each verse in some sort of contemporary sentiment, you know. And you notice in the first couple of verses, you see the word over and over again: down, 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 down. Everything is coming down. And when suffering is real, everything feels like it's falling apart. Everything feels like it's coming to the end of itself. Everything that once made us feel confident now makes us feel insecure. Everything that we put our pride in is now making us feel humiliated. All the things that we thought were our strengths have now become our weaknesses. Everything that we thought we could rely on now is in ruins. And you feel like earlier you would feel like you could walk into any room with confidence. Now you don't want to show your face to anybody. I used to feel surrounded by God, but now I feel abandoned by Him. And you see this, there's this very realistic look at suffering, right? Even the whole structure of Lamentations is 4 of the chapters are what they call Acrostic Psalms. That means there's 22 verses that correspond to the 22 alphabets of Hebrew. So every sentence is actually beginning with in order of the alphabet. So if it was in English, the first sentence with A, the second sentence with B, the third verse with C, and the fourth verse with D. So it's an artistic presentation, but it's also got some meaning. It's basically saying, I've been through the entire totality of suffering. Everything that you could possibly think is painful, I've experienced it. I've been through the A to Z of suffering. This is my reality. And I want you to know, a lot of Christians find it very hard to read the Old Testament. And I want you to know You cannot understand the Old Testament until you've come to a point of utter brokenness. If your heart has never been broken, you'll never understand the Old Testament. If you've never seen injustice, you'll never understand the Old Testament. Because the Old Testament is not meant to be read from a position of privilege, from a position of power, or from a position of comfort. It's written out of suffering, and it's written for people in suffering. It is a meditation on suffering. So you have in the Old Testament suffering all the way through. And that's why we want to be saying through the series that Christians are actually most equipped to suffer well, but often least aware of it, least aware of what we have been given so that we can suffer well. And you can't understand. So, for instance, if you're on a Zoom call today on a Sunday morning, right, instead of a cement mixer trying to get home, you are privileged. You are privileged. And I want you to know the poor and the powerless, and many of the people hearing this lament are in that category. They've lost everything. Their city is in ruins. Babylon has come in like ISIS 10 times worse and has done their worst. And and if you remember, you got to recognize ancient cultures didn't have the values that modern cultures do. So modern cultures still do this, right? They still go to war, but they cover it up. They cover up all their misdeeds. They don't gloat about it. But in the Babylonian age, if you went to a Babylonian and said, "Listen, why didn't you kill that baby? Don't you feel bad about it?" The Babylonians would say, "Hey, we won." There is no sense of injustice in their minds. Their value is it's better them than us, and there's no shame in it. There's no desire to cover up. Victory is pronounced in such graphic terms, and that's why I don't want to read the whole chapter to you. But it's not safe. It's not safe to do that with children listening. This chapter is for adults only. It's such a graphic description of the suffering that Jerusalem is experiencing. And I want you to know, you can't understand the Old Testament until you've experienced heartbreak and until you've seen injustice and until you've felt the anger and the desire to get revenge. You can't understand the Old Testament. And I want you to know that. So, but it's important because we are equipped to suffer well because we have a family history of people who have suffered well. And it's very important to know that. And what this essentially means is that a lament essentially means that the Bible takes two things very seriously. It says that suffering is real and God is real. And it takes these two things very seriously. It does not minimize either one. See, we minimize one or the other. We separate the two of them. So there's some people who will only see that suffering is real, and for them God is not real. All hope is imagined hope. All notions of a better world, they're all fantasy. All notions of God, all can't be trusted. Only suffering is real, because that's the only thing I can see. And the most heartbreaking thing about a consequence of that is what's happened with a couple of people recently. So in New York City, a doctor who's been treating COVID patients for since this crisis emerged, she had a break and she took her own life because she couldn't take it anymore. In Germany, one of the state finance ministers, soon after this broke out, he saw the economic fallout, deeply worried, and threw himself in front of a train. Last week I talked to you about a picture that Kevin Carter took about of a child dying and a vulture waiting for it to die so that it could feast. The child survived, but Kevin Carter committed suicide. And the dangerous thing about believing that only suffering is real is that when you're tempted to take your own life, you're actually tempted to believe that only my suffering is real. Nothing else is real. Nothing else is real. And when you do that, when you go in that direction, you're essentially thinking unbiblically, because the Bible actually takes suffering seriously and God seriously. But there's a flip side also, right? If you think only God is real and suffering is not real, so you'll end up minimizing suffering, you'll end up neglecting it, and you'll end up even mocking it. So I remember it's heartbreaking, but it's also cautionary that there's a pastor in the U.S. who refused to heed the warnings of getting together and refused to cancel his services, and then he got coronavirus, and then he died. You know, and that's both heartbreaking and cautionary at the same time. But that's what happens when you only think that God is real and suffering is not real. There's a danger in which we become naive, we go into denial, and we minimize other people's suffering. And then if somebody comes and tells you they're suffering, you kind of say, get over it, have more faith. And then you add suffering upon suffering. So this is not the way the Bible thinks, right? A lament says that suffering is real and God is real. And lament doesn't come out of bitterness of heart. It actually comes out of tenderness of heart. It actually comes out of brokenness of heart. See, suffering in silence is hardness of heart. Suffering in silence is essentially saying, I'm going to lock the doors of my heart from the inside so that nobody can get in again and hurt me. I'm not going to let this happen again. But when suffering happens, lament actually opens the doors, opens the windows, gets out onto the street and cries out to God and says, I won't let suffering stay in here. I won't let the stench of suffering stay in here. I'm going to open all the doors so that the fresh air of God's grace can get in. That's what a lament does. A lament is actually tenderness of heart. So, and it's both beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. So the first question I want to ask you is, do you know what your heart is biased towards? Do you know whether you're biased towards thinking that only my suffering is real? Or are you more biased towards thinking only God is real? Only my feelings about God are real. And you tend to minimize suffering. And because a sign of being able of holding these two things together in tension is that you'll actually find lament natural, and you'll also find it necessary. If suffering is real, then a lament is both natural and necessary. I just read an article recently on how it's called How PTSD Treatment Can Learn from Ancient Warrior Rituals. So post-traumatic stress disorder is characterized by three things. At least this article says identity, time, and cognition, right? So in identity, after the trauma, the person doesn't know who they are anymore. They struggle to identify with the person that they were before the trauma. They can't connect the two. There's a disruption of time where the past continues to invade the present. So either in nightmares or in flashbacks or in repeated experiences of the past, they're living in the shadow of the past. And the third is a rupture of cognition, right? There's a failing of words. You don't even know how to describe what happened because it doesn't make sense to you. And you can't even name the feelings that you're going through. And this article says that ancient cultures actually understood better than us how to aid warriors when they returned from war, because he talks about how, particularly in the Old Testament, Israelites are instructed to purify themselves before entering back into the camp after a battle. The Masai Mara has rituals like that. The Romans have rituals like that. Ancient cultures understand the trauma that it does for soldiers coming back from war. And Israel is, but here what you're seeing is that a lament is actually a purification ritual, not for the effects of being in a war, but for the effects of somebody else inflicting war on you, for the suffering that you've experienced at the hands of somebody else. And Israel has experienced this horrific violence. Okay, read chapter 2, go to the end, and you'll see horrific descriptions of what they've experienced. This is trauma times 10. And Lamentation says, in this suffering, don't be silent. And they're inspired by God in the suffering to lament, because the lament is a purification ritual to protect us from the lasting effects of suffering. It's a purification ritual to protect us from the lasting effects of suffering. So it's natural and necessary, and it's possible only when you recognize that both God is real and suffering is real. But let's look at how the lament takes God to be real. So suffering is real, but God is real. In the first 8 verses of the whole lament, right, the subject is God. And there's 28 verbs of destruction. 28 times we're told something is being destroyed. And all of the times, it's God doing it. All of the time, it's God doing it. God has done this. 2 times the writer says, God has become like an enemy to me. God has become like an enemy, and Jerusalem is destroyed. And I want you to focus just on the one verse because there's just so much to think. But look at the first verse. He has cast down from heaven to earth the splendor of Israel. And that points to the temple. The temple is destroyed. So Jerusalem is the center of Judah, and the temple is the center of Jerusalem. And the temple is destroyed. And the temple is the link between heaven and earth. So in a sense, it's almost as if God is saying, my covenant with you is broken. I'm no longer yours. And he's actually acting in accordance with the covenant when he brings this disaster. So it's a shattering picture of a broken relationship. So almost like in a couple that's having a fight where the girl or the guy takes off the ring, throws it on the ground, and says to the other person, "I'm not yours anymore." It's a shattering end to a relationship. And the rest of the chapter details this brutality of Babylon's violence against Jerusalem. And remember, 8 times the writer is saying, "You did this. The Lord has done this. The Lord has done this." So this is not a philosophical question. Right? This is a personal complaint. This is not just he's not just musing about some philosophically about why is there suffering. He's actually experiencing suffering, going to God and saying, "You did this to me. You did this to me." So Babylon is the physical enemy. But in a sense, it happened under God's watch. And it happened because God removed his protection from Jerusalem. So in one sense, in verse 3, it says, he has withdrawn from them his right hand in the face of the enemy. He's withdrawn his protection. And this is very important because you've got to at some point ask, what is this stuff doing in the Bible? Like, why are words like why are complaints like this in the Bible? I mean, if somebody, I can think of churches and pastors where if you talk like this about God, they would tell you, no, don't talk like that. Don't say those things. You don't talk like that about God. You don't do that. And I want to kind of ask you, like, what kind of powerful person would give, or what kind of powerful government, what kind of powerful politician would give this kind of freedom to its journalists? Would any king, would any ruler give it this kind of freedom to its journalists? Would any company give this kind of freedom to its to be looked into, to be examined, to be searched? No one would. I mean, India was ranked 140 out of 180 countries on the Press Freedom Index. That was last year. I don't know what's happening this year, but powerful people don't give freedom to other people to complain against them. So why does God do it? And not only why does God do it, why does he do it in a way where he hears the lament and he says, you know what, let's publish this so that not only will I hear it, but the whole world will hear it. And even 2,500 years later, a church meeting on Zoom in Delhi will hear it. What kind of a king gives that kind of freedom to people? Only a king who knows that you're not a threat to his power. Only a king who knows who's not insecure. Only a king who none of his authority is undermined. None of it. There's no insecurity in him. He's completely secure in himself. Completely true to his nature, and completely confident that he can withstand the scrutiny. And I want you to know that this is important for us because our laments, our complaints, our questions, they can't wound him. They can't undermine his authority. But the only thing that might grieve him is our silence. Is that we're not willing to talk to him. We want to walk away. We don't want to engage with him. We don't want to lament. We only want to believe that suffering is real. We don't want to believe that God is real. But if God is real, then you can engage with him. And a lament doesn't, and ultimately, God gives you this complaint because he is the king. He's the king, and this king cannot be dethroned. And there's no threat to him, there's no insecurity in him. And a lament ultimately does not change who God is, but it can change who you become. It can change who you become. Because if you keep the suffering in you, in silence, and you turn away from God, the first question to ask is, what are you turning away to? What's left? What's there? Because the disciples were faced with. The disciples are facing Jesus in a difficult time, and he asked them, "Are you also going to leave?" And they say, "To whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." So if you turn away from God, you turn away from the King, the only thing you're left with is suffering. And now you're left with suffering without hope, without meaning, without purpose, without anything. But in a lament, we hold the tension together that God is real and, and suffering is real. And I want you to know, when you know that God is real, then you can be real with people. When you know that God is real, then you can be real with people. This is a public lament. Right? It's not a private lament. It's not a journal. I mean, when I was 11 to 13 years old, there was this thing called the Target Diary. It used to come out every year, and it was the highlight of my year to get the Target Diary. And I used to write in this diary religiously every day, pretty much the same thing. Went to school, came back, had lunch, this, that. It was like Twitter for the 1990s before you could do anything about that. And the most fearful thing for me was if somebody read my diary. If somebody opened it and actually read the things that I wrote inside. And I was like 11 to 13 insecure child, But we're like that as adults too. We don't want anybody to read our diary. We don't want anyone to know what's really going on in our hearts. We don't want anyone to see us in that way. We don't want that. Trust, because we'll say to ourselves, I trust God, but his people, I don't know. I don't know about that. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know where that's going to go. And the thing about trust is we want trust from everyone, but we usually don't we rarely offer it to anyone. We want it from everyone, but we rarely offer it to anyone. And I don't want you to get the idea that we should trust everyone. Okay, you shouldn't trust everyone, but you probably shouldn't suspect everyone either. You should carefully trust some people. And suffering in silence as a Christian, it's just adding suffering to suffering. It's suffering 2 times over. And a lament, a public lament, not just a private one, a public lament is possible when you know that God is real. And when you know that he has first heard your lament. The King has heard your lament. He's valued your lament. He's seen your suffering. He takes it as seriously as anybody else does. And he's as seriously as you do. And when you trust that he's heard your lament, then you can trust other people with it. You can go out and you can be real with people when you know that God is real. And the interesting thing is, people will only trust you most if you trust them first. People will only trust you most if you trust them first. So how do you do this? How do you lament publicly? How do you take both God and suffering to be real at the same time? How do you experience the reality of suffering and the reality of God at the same time? You've got to remember that rescue is real. That rescue is real. Let's look at that first verse and just go over it again. So here's what the prophet says: "How the Lord in his anger has set the daughter of Zion under a cloud. He has cast down from heaven to earth the splendor of Israel. He has not remembered his footstool in the day of his anger." In the reason the invasion of Jerusalem is happening is because God's mercy has been rejected for centuries. Centuries of warnings have been given. Jeremiah most recently for 40 years has been predicting what's going to happen. They had every opportunity to repent, and it's rejected. God's mercy is rejected in the old agreement, but it will be renewed in a new agreement, in a new covenant. And the laments, even in the lament in verse 17, ultimately after the prophet says all these things, he says, that you were right. You did this, but you also warned us, and you decided this long ago, and you told us about it. So even the lament, and even later on in Chronicles, when they're interpreting their own history, they recognize this. They recognize that God had been merciful, but we're the ones who mocked him. We're the ones who rejected him. We're the ones who turned away from him. So when you're thinking about ancient cultures, you have to let them interpret their own history rather than you interpreting the history from the 21st century. And in their own interpretation of history, they recognize that God was merciful and he was just in his judgments. He was right. And that's usually what a lament does. It actually takes you from beginning the lament by saying, this is all your fault, this is all your fault, this is all your fault. And then at the end of the lament, you come to realize, you know, part of it is probably my fault. And you are right. You are just. You are good. That's the journey of a lament. But here's the so what is this that God has done, right? What is he done? The great shock is that he's destroyed the temple, right? So the splendor of Israel he has cast down from heaven to earth. Now, if you remember 2011, I was actually at a conference. Actually, it was a Monday night, I think, or I can't remember what day it was. It was a night time where the news came on and of a plane that had crashed into the Twin Towers. It was a shock to the whole world because the splendor of New York City was the Twin Towers. And I watched the second plane crash into the Twin Towers. And the whole world is in shock. They're devastated, right? They can't believe what's happening because the splendor of New York is destroyed. And what a shock it was, right? But in Jerusalem, the splendor of Jerusalem is the temple. That's the center of the city. And like I said earlier, the temple is the link between heaven and earth. Now imagine if we're all on a Zoom call on the internet and in a lockdown, what if somebody shut down the internet and destroyed the link between all of us? I mean, we'd be pretty devastated that we can't talk to each other. We can't connect to one another. We can't relate to one another. And when the temple is destroyed, Israel knows that the link to God is cut off. So it's devastating. Okay? And it's a shattering picture of a broken relationship. And that's why the shock. So the first word in the lament is the same as the first word in chapter 1, which is kind of difficult to translate, but basically has this meaning of, I can see what's happening, but I can't believe what I'm seeing. I know I can see what's happening, but I can't believe it's happening. And the real question is, how can this be happening? How is this possible? How is it possible for something like this to be happening? And I want to point to you the greater shock, because this is a shock, but the greater shock is what God will do later on. And he will do something more devastating than this. And not to a building, but to a body. Not to a physical temple, but to the true temple. Not to the daughter of Zion, but to the Son of God. And not to the splendor of Israel, but to the splendor of the whole universe. And he will not be cast down just from heaven to earth. He will be cast down from heaven to earth down to the depths of the earth. And God will set him under clouds of judgment, and God will set him to a cross. And it's a kind of suffering that you can't look at without looking away. And when you look at Jesus on the cross, I want you to know this. You are looking at God. It's the only time in history where you're looking at both God and suffering at the same time. Only at the cross. You are looking at God and suffering at the same time. And on the cross, God is real and suffering is real. And it's embodied in the splendor of the whole universe, under clouds of judgment, cast down from heaven to earth, down to the depths of the earth, on a cross. And it's something you can't look at without looking away. And at the cross, you have to be asking, how can this be happening? I can see what's happening, but I can't believe what my eyes are seeing. How can this be happening? How can God be doing this to the true temple of God? It's not just the physical temple, it's the true temple of God who is in ruins. And what happens now? And you remember what Jesus said when he was at the temple himself. He was at the physical temple and he sees this trade and this marketplace of conmen, just trying to scams running everywhere. And he throws the tables over and they question him. And he says what? He says, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. Destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. And you've got to ask, why was he destroyed? Why was this temple destroyed? And that's the greatest shock. The greatest shock is that he has turned his enemies, that's you and me, into a temple. He's made us a temple. So there's a reason that he was destroyed for the future. There's a reason that he's destroyed now. Why was he destroyed with relation to the future? He was destroyed so that we can become a temple that can never be forsaken. We can become a temple that will never be abandoned. We can be a temple that he will never cast down. We can be a temple that will never be under the clouds of judgment. We can be a temple that will never be abandoned or forsaken. That's what 1 Corinthians 3:16 says. And remember, Corinth is the city full of people that know everything. Right? They know everything about everything. All kinds of speech, all kinds of knowledge. They know everything about everything. And Paul puts this poignant question. He says, don't you know this? You know all these things, but do you not know? Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person. For God's temple is holy and you are that temple. God's temple is holy and you are that temple. Don't you know? I mean, Delhi is the same as Corinth. Everybody knows everything about everything. So you could ask the same question, but don't you know this? Do you not know this? Do you not know that you are God's temple and that you will not be destroyed? So the beauty of the Trinity is at play here, right? The Father sends the Son to the cross so that the Son can send God's Spirit into your hearts, and you can become a temple that will never be forsaken. But there's a reason for now as well. It's a reason for now. Why did Jesus suffer the way that he did? And it's so that all our suffering can become like his suffering. All our suffering can become like his suffering, because his suffering goes from the cross to the grave to the sky. Remember that old song, Lord, I lift your name on high. He came from heaven to earth, from the earth to the cross, from the cross to the grave, and from the grave to the sky. Lord, I lift your name on high. You know, what it's essentially saying is all Jesus' suffering goes through the cross to resurrection, to glory. And all our suffering, when we're in him, goes through that same journey. We go through suffering to glory. And we follow him in that way. That's why in Romans 8:17, Paul says, now if we are children, then we are heirs. We are heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. That means what Jesus gets, we get. What belongs to him belongs to us. What he inherits, we inherit. And he says, if indeed we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory. And I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. That's the future. Jesus is on a rescue mission. And it's like we're hostages in a camp, and we were in despair. We were not knowing what to do. But the rescue team has arrived. It's here. But we're still not out of the forest. We're still not out of the woods. But he's going to lead us through the suffering. And he's going to lead us through his suffering to his glory, so that we can share in his glory just as we've shared in his sufferings. Let me close with this. So if you remember the Lord of the Rings, the Two Towers, there's this, towards the end of the movie, there's this dark scene in which Frodo's got the ring and he's kind of hypnotically walking towards the Nazgul, and the Nazgul is drawn to the ring is drawn to Nazgul, and Frodo's kind of almost giving in, and Sam jumps in and pulls him away, and Frodo in his hypnotic state turns on Sam. He takes out his sword, is about to stab him in the heart, and Sam says, it's me, it's your Sam, don't you know you're Sam? And Frodo kind of pauses, and he goes back and he comes to his senses. And he's kind of sitting there and saying, listen, I can't do this, Sam. I can't do this. And Sam goes and says, I know. It's all wrong. By rights, we shouldn't even be here. And you can hear thunderclouds in the sky. And he says, but we're here. And he says, it's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered, full of darkness and danger, they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end, because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad has happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come, and when the sun shines, it will shine out the clearer. Those were the stories that stayed with you. That meant something. even if you were too small to understand why. But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. I know now. Folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going because they were holding on to something. And Frodo asked, what are we holding on to, Sam? What are we holding on to, Sam? And I want to tell you, we're not holding on to something. Someone is holding on to us. We are his temple. He will never let go. And if you know that, you can suffer well and you can lament well, because you know that all your sufferings are going to be like his sufferings, and all of his glory is going to be yours. Let's pray. Father, we are just overwhelmed by the reality of suffering that we see all around us, not just in this crisis, Lord, but even before it, and when we know because of the state of the world, even after this. But we don't want to give in to what we see with our physical eyes. We don't want to just believe that suffering is real and you are not. But we want to, with the eyes of our hearts, we want the eyes of our hearts to be opened to know that you are real. And we want to know that you are the King, Lord. And no state of the world can undermine your authority as the King. No rebellion, no disobedience, no evil, no darkness, Lord, can overthrow your authority. And we want to remember that. We want to know that you are real. And we want to just embrace that shock, Lord, of seeing Jesus on the cross and in history, Lord, for the first time, seeing both God and suffering at the same time. And what a shocking thing, Lord. What a shocking thing that you would send your own son and put his body on the cross and destroy that temple so that we can become your temple that can never be forsaken, never be abandoned. Because you've put your seal on us, Lord. You put a seal on us through your Spirit, guaranteeing the deposit, guaranteeing the inheritance, Lord. And we just thank you for this gift. And we pray, Lord, that as we enjoy the benefits of belonging to you, Lord, that you will teach us not only to suffer well, but also to be a way of healing for those who are suffering around us, Lord, and offer comfort and hope, and be able to share our hope in you, Lord, in these trying times. We ask all this in Jesus' name.